This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Every now and then, my job as podcast host is to get out of the way. This is going to be one of those episodes. We have two stellar reporters with us to help education journalists figure out how to navigate the unprecedented landscape of the coming academic year. I've asked them to share some story ideas for kicking off the fall amid the turmoil of the COVID-19 pandemic. Bianca Vasquez Toness is a reporter for the Boston Globe and a member of the newspaper's educational equity team. Bianca, we're delighted to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
And we're also joined by Lindsay Ellis. She covers research universities for the Chronicle of Higher Education. She's a senior reporter, and she's also a former beat reporter for the Houston Chronicle. Lindsay, great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we need to decide quickly, K-12 higher ed, which goes first. Bianca, you're at the front of the alphabet. You get to call it. I've got a virtual coin in my hand. I'm tossing it. You want to call it heads or tails?
Heads.
It is heads. Lindsay, I read that statistical thing where it says that it's head. I think it was 51% of the time, just by the face of that part of the coin being heavier, and it comes down more often.
So, really?
Yeah, so that was a good call. So Lindsay, you're going to sit tight for a minute. We're going to start with K-12.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So, Bianca, as I said, you're on the educational equity team at the Boston Globe, but it feels like right now every reporter in the country is on the equity beat.
Yes, I think they should be. This pandemic has definitely focused everyone's minds on who's getting what they need, if they're getting what they need, all of the obstacles and barriers that are preventing students from getting what they need and parents from getting what they need. I think you're right. Everyone needs to think about equity more than ever at this moment.
I want to go right to your story ideas. And first up, you wanted to talk about teachers. What's on their plate? What are we thinking about when we think about what school looks like right now for them?
Well, at least where I live, I think it's fair to assume that a good number of children will be in remote learning, either all of the fall, some of the fall. There will be a good number of students who either opt into it or don't have a choice. And I don't hear enough about what remote learning will look like this fall. And I think one way to focus reporting would be to ask the question of how many hours teachers are going to be required to give instruction to students in their MOUs. Not every district comes up with an MOU, but I think a lot of unions who are really exercising their voices powerfully right now are pushing to have MOUs, and those documents are easy to get. And it'd be interesting to compare districts and ask the question if, is it enough? Is it enough time that they're committing to spend instructing students?
Bianca, part of your big story on the union piece of this puzzle is whether teachers are going to use the leverage on what's being taught and not just how and when. What are some of the things that teachers say could be added to the curriculum right now? I'm thinking about things along the lines of social emotional learning, helping kids develop empathy, and monitoring and regulating their own behavior. Let's talk a little bit about that.
That is their main argument, at least in Massachusetts, right? That there should be more emphasis on social emotional learning, that there should be time built into the beginning of the year to check in with families, check in with students, interview them about what worked for them, what didn't work for them, even meet them in person, right? In socially distanced outside settings, and reconnecting and asking those questions. They're definitely arguing for a lot of time spent on social emotional learning, more time than is usually spent. They're also arguing for curriculum that responds to the Black Lives Matter movement and anti-racist teaching. And they're also arguing for project-based learning in places where, that hasn't really been an emphasis in Massachusetts before.
So I think that's a good question for reporters to be thinking about as they head into the fall, is not just what is teaching going to look like, but what is in that curriculum, what's new, what's different, who's approved it, who's vetted, and who's been trained.
Yeah, exactly. And how much time is actually built in for training. In Massachusetts, the teachers, and I would say this seemed very reasonable to me, that they pushed back the opening so that they could spend more time on training. Obviously, there is a lot that teachers need to talk about, principals need to talk about, and they argued that they needed more time both for training and for connecting with families and getting their input.
Another story you wanted to talk about has to do with choice, but it's also a story broadly about equity, and that is what the numbers are going to look like this fall in terms of enrollment. Tell us a little bit more about what you're thinking about that.
Well, I hear from schools, and I also hear just from, folks that I know, that the population in schools is going to look really different, or could look really different in the fall. Schools are worried that the same kids who were signed up a month ago aren't the same kids who are going to be there when school actually happens. And so there will be impacts on school budgets because of that, which is, one type of story. Another is who will be leaving. There will likely be folks who have choice and have the privilege, the luxury to move somewhere else. But then there are folks, and this is speculation on my part, that English learners and immigrants who, from my reporting, don't seem to have gotten very much out of remote learning. These are folks who are, say, in the beginning stages of English acquisition and are under immense pressure, some of them, to earn a living and to pay the rent. And so they'll be making a choice between spending time online and not advancing much or getting a paycheck. And some of them might not come back to school.
Well, obviously, I mean, that would be devastating for them, but, you're also thinking about things like enrollment count days when districts get their funding and get their money. I mean, in a lot of states, that September count day is crucial.
Exactly. So I know that is a concern for, districts like Boston, for example, and they don't have a way to gauge it ahead of time, right? People aren't responding in great numbers to their surveys, just asking whether they want hybrid or remote learning. So we don't know if that's because people aren't planning to come back or because people just aren't, engaged. They don't receive the emails. They don't receive the messages on Facebook because schools sometimes aren't great at reaching all parents.
Well, that actually jumps right into another story you want to talk about, and that's parental engagement. And I think this is really important right now, which is for reporters to be aware of the messaging that's going out to parents, to ask to see it, to be copied on those emails if you don't have parents forwarding them to you, do an open records request, and find out how much time is happening there. What else should people be thinking about in terms of parent engagement?
That's a great idea, right? To get those emails. I'd also be wondering what modes they use of communication, because I've heard so many times that districts are using Facebook, for example, to survey parents. Not everyone's on Facebook. Not everyone's looking at it all the time. Or they might use email, and a lot of parents, again, don't use email. So I think that they need to consider using multiple modes, robocalls, text messaging. I don't hear much about text messaging, actually. I hear about robocalls. In some cases, I hear about social media. So that's one question. Are they reaching parents where they are? Another question, which comes out of a story I did that showed that some districts were calling DCF and reporting parents when they couldn't reach them enough, or their students weren't participating at all or enough in remote learning. And I am wondering the steps that districts are taking, right? And if they're satisfactory for reaching out to parents before they take, more drastic measures.
Certainly, this question of virtual truancy, what is the bar for it? When do you decide that a student isn't online enough or isn't engaged in the classroom? I mean, I think that's just going to be a huge story this fall and a pretty fascinating one.
For sure. And when so many people I know in my newsroom or in my community read that story and said, I'm so lucky that no one called me from DCF because my kids were not online. So the question is also, who are they reporting? Are they reporting middle class professionals the way that they're reporting people of color and low income folks? I mean, I think there are different expectations and people read into the participation differently. I think, there are other questions about how schools might coach parents and might help them help their own children participate, right? We know a lot of parents were completely flummoxed by the types of software and applications or the type of teaching pedagogy and the description of the curriculum A lot of parents complained, I'm not a teacher. I don't know how to teach my child how to read. And they're asking me to do all of these things. And it seems to me that I know that there's a lot of pushback about time on screens for kids, but it seems like their teachers could be spending time on screens with parents to teach them these things. And that could also count, as teaching and as learning during this time. I mean, parents need help.
There's another vulnerable group that you wanted to talk about in terms of students who are most at risk for losing learning and really falling behind here, and that's special education students. What's happening in Boston?
Well, we know that special education students have the lowest rates of participation in remote learning in the spring, and that many districts across the state weren't meeting the students' IEPs, and that districts are grappling with how to make up for that. They have this dilemma about, whether they should try to, provide lots of services remotely, even though they know they're not going to have the same impact that they will if they were to be in person. So they're trying to decide, should we wait until these kids are back in person, or should we load up on services now remotely, even if we know they're inadequate? And these are the types of decisions they're making. And I think that that's something we should be tracking. And also asking the question of the state, whether these kids deserve more time at the end.
There's an education story at the K-12 side that I want to read. Can I tell you what it is?
Yes.
Okay. With the caveat and understanding that this is going to be challenging and maybe it will take more than one reporter to do it. I want to follow kids this year. I want somebody to pick a grade, any grade. Give me a third grader. Give me an eighth grader. Give me a high school junior. Follow somebody who's in the district's traditional program, whatever that's going to look like. Follow somebody who's in a charter school that's online, and then also follow someone who's decided to homeschool. And then tell me what those experiences look like for those students in the same grades with the same academic expectations and the same standards that they have to follow, and what their year looks like.
It's a great idea.
Go do it.
Well, what's interesting is that in Boston, the charter schools appear to be starting off and seem to be planning to be remote the whole time. They're not even pretending to be playing around with hybrid plans or anything like that, probably because they had figured out remote learning fairly well in the spring. So they're running into it with confidence.
There's something to be said for that.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what their experiences are like. I mean, these students also seem to be a little overwhelmed with too much remote learning, too much time on task, too much screen time, but perhaps they'll strike a balance this fall.
We're talking with education reporters Bianca Vasquez Toness of the Boston Globe and Lindsay Ellis of the Chronicle of Higher Education about their big story ideas for the new academic year. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us grow. Lindsay, you've been very patient. We appreciate it. We're going to turn now to higher education. You're in the thick of covering the crisis right now. What's the big question that's keeping you up at night?
Oh, goodness. There are a lot of them. I think, the big thing that I see so many stories and, responses coming back to is, what is higher education doing for its communities, its regions, its students, its employees this fall? I think in a lot of ways, colleges have really social good mission statement. I mean, getting a college degree means so much for an adult's success in the American economy today. And the research that campuses do on a lot of the schools that I cover, they make real differences in the day-to-day life of everybody. But the question is, how are policies this fall made by campus leaders? How are those policies either reinforcing this aspect of being a social good or, undermining that aspect? And what happens this semester? Who pulls it off? Who gets hurt? And what policies enabled either of those outcomes?
Well, the story ideas you wanted to talk about get at that big picture question that you're posing right here. And let's start with some of the colleges that started this fall with in-person and hybrid and have now reversed course because of outbreaks and frankly, just students not following the rules. The University of North Carolina has been very much in the headlines because of this. What should we be paying attention to?
We have a few reporters, I think, in North Carolina right now. The story as that went was UNC Chapel Hill brought students back and soon afterwards said, this isn't working. It's not going to be the only school that does that. I think that's what sources are telling me, and scholars of higher education are anticipating too. I think a really interesting story that could work in a lot of different communities would be getting in touch with as many students as you can on those campuses that bring people back and then send them away, and just tallying up the costs. I mean, the costs of higher ed for students and families, that is one of the biggest issues that they face that enable retention, that enable graduation, is being able to pay for it. And if you can get a few students and sort of walk through exactly what that getting to campus and coming back home costs, I think that could really be either an early indicator of or just a quick snapshot of the retention challenges that colleges are going to face, because the costs of getting to college this fall are even even greater than they would be in a normal semester. I mean, not only are you accounting for lost wages if you need to isolate beforehand, but think of the cleaning supplies and masks and sort of setting up another household if you're living on campus. That'll take a lot, and last minute travel isn't cheap either.
A big component of any of these plans working to bring kids back is that people, especially the students, are going to follow the rules. What's the story there?
Yeah, I think that is sort of a big thing that we're hearing. I mean, the messaging from campus leaders is, it's on you. And I was at the University of Kentucky reporting last week, and the way they were sort of framing it is, it requires you to follow the rules to stay in line for us to be able to make it to November. I think student behavior is going to be front of mind in a lot of coverage, but I think reporters should also sort of look closely at the policies that sort of enabled or, looked the other way to allow students to gather in the first place. I think, if there was a cluster or if there's an individual case, how did that happen? And what campus policies allowed for that to happen? Who might have looked the other way? What motivated every step? And really being able to trace that to what happens at the top, I think would be really instructive.
Well, it's really interesting because, Bianca was talking about this idea of calling the authorities to report parents as negligent if their kids don't show up at school. But with colleges, what authority do they really have? I mean, these are adults. They're young adults, but they're still adults. In some cases, colleges have suspended them. But this also brings in an interesting question, I think, about the town and gown relationship here for enforcement.
I think that's a really crucial question. And I think for good reason right now, a lot of students are wary of a greater police presence, in their day-to-day life, on their campuses. The way schools are enforcing social distancing and the like really does vary from place to place. There's sort of a lot of talk of we're going to handle this through regular student conduct. But of course, there is communication from your local police department and campus police leaders, or your local police department and administrators. And that dynamic, I think, will be one to watch closely.
Well, there's a story that I'm hoping to see a little bit more coverage on, and that's going to be the impact of this pandemic on Greek life, on fraternities and sororities. And I'm wondering if this could possibly be the death knell for some of those programs, some of which are controversial.
Certainly, student behavior in those spaces is going to be under close scrutiny. I've already seen so many headlines about a cluster traced to a Greek house. There's also been some activism this summer. My colleague Sarah Brown wrote a story about students, even some in Greek life, sort of arguing for the end of these spaces. I think that was less of a COVID-focused response and more of a social justice-focused response. But there is going to be pressure, not just for public health reasons, but for more activist reasons as well.
The pandemic is obviously impacting every aspect of higher education right now, but there's also the ongoing effects of the nationwide protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. What should reporters be thinking about in terms of covering that piece of the story?
So early in the summer, especially, there was a lot of student activism and faculty activism, even remotely on racial justice and the Black Lives Matter movement. This summer, students were expressing several demands, and at several campuses, there was some movement in campus leadership. A lot of those decisions were focused on renaming and the like, but I think the big question is what comes next, and will anything structurally change in higher ed, which, on many campuses, they are still segregated, and the percentages of people of color in the student body and on the faculty are remarkably stubborn. And the real push, I think, that I'll have my eye on is what inherently changes in this moment. And also, if administrators drop the ball or don't sufficiently act, what happens to trust between students and their campus leaders? What happens to trust between faculty and their campus leaders? It's already really tenuous right now. And I think a failure to be responsive or act sufficiently could have a big effect.
I do think that this is a great opportunity for higher education reporters to really be building out some of these sources. And what I'm thinking about are these virtual town halls that a lot of colleges and universities are holding. I mean, often those things are just a blur of activity. You're running around the room, you're trying to grab people, people slip out. Now you've got it on tape.
I think that is a game changer. I was attending some of the planning meetings for a reopening process, and I was on mute and the campus knew I was there, but being able to watch internally and ask for that access is something that I don't think would have been possible when everybody was just meeting in a conference room. For more public facing meetings, right? I mean, you can very quickly copy and paste a list of attendees, be it parents or be it students or administrators. You can look at who's saying what in the chat. And I think there will be some really good public records requests to do for meetings that are recorded, town halls, or even planning meetings. We'll just have to see. And I think that'll probably be a campus specific question. Who is recording what and how are folks meeting remotely?
Bianca and I talked about the big question in K 12 being who's going to show up this fall. That's a question, too, isn't it, for higher education, specifically for community colleges?
I think that's always a question for campuses which rely on both money from the state, which is often determined by enrollment, and also tuition costs. I think there have been a lot of surveys this summer predicting various enrollment trends. I am definitely curious to see how that plays out, especially in the community college space. Community college enrollment in the last recession grew because there wasn't as much of an opportunity cost of stepping away from employment to go to college when, so many people lost their jobs. I think actually a really interesting narrative story on the community college front would be, from the point of view or really focused in on an enrollment staff at a local community college. I'm curious what questions they are fielding, how busy they are getting, and also what expectations their bosses are putting on them. If there's a vice president or a campus leader who is saying you need to meet these goals, how do they do that and where do they fall short? I think that'll be a big question too.
I think anyone who's talking to college students right now doesn't have to go very far to find somebody who says that they've put a hold on their decision to go to an out-of-state college or university, and they've decided instead to take their prerequisite classes at the local community college.
Right. If it's online either way, I think that is a calculation that makes a lot of sense. I mean, dollars and cents certainly, but also, eliminating the uncertainty of what going out of state would mean. I think it would be a lot more straightforward to just enroll in a place that you know what's going to happen.
Bianca, I want to pull you back into the conversation here. And, community colleges are one of those places where students do dual credit programs at a lot of the high schools where kids can earn their associate degree. That seems like it might be a good crossover story. What do you think?
For sure. I mean, the thing that I keep hearing from students who were graduating this year was how will colleges, when they arrive, right, without having received a very rigorous education for the last, 3 months of school, how are they going to make up for that, right? How will colleges help those students fill the gaps and make sure that they are prepared for the next stage of calculus if they didn't receive, all of the lessons in the last 3 months of school. A lot of students feel unprepared. So I wonder how community colleges, what kind of remediation they'll have to do, but also four-year colleges, what will they need to do to bring these kids up to speed?
So there's one more crossover story I want to raise for both of you, and that's because of the age group coming from high school seniors into their freshman year, and that is first-time voters in this presidential election year, a very contentious year, and the youth vote could have a sizable impact, particularly at the state level. I'm curious to hear from both of you. Are you thinking at all about that for the fall?
I would imagine that a lot more 18-year-olds are going to be motivated to vote, period. And they'll be probably voting closer to home than they typically would be.
Yeah, I think one story idea along those lines would be at many residential universities, there are mechanisms that make it easy or as easy as it can be to vote via buses or transportation to the polling station or campus groups like College Democrats or College Republicans, reminding folks to register. I wonder if without sort of that physical reminder, if a campus hasn't brought people back, if it will be as front of mind. So that's maybe something to think about. Even though the DNC convention this week was playing out, I think it's hard not to be in August and think about, much more than reopening at this point. It's hard to see beyond September 1st.
That's a fair point.
Yeah. I would imagine, though, that if students are at home with their parents, if many of them are studying remotely, that they might be even more motivated to vote than they would have been if they'd been on a campus. I mean, I think that a lot of the activism around George Floyd's murder was, because people were at home and their minds had been sort of liberated from all of the activities that people are usually involved in that distract them from thinking about the news. And I think that it has focused the mind in a way that has allowed activism to flourish, and people have been much more, focused and present than I think they typically would be. So I could imagine a much greater voter turnout just because people are at home and people are energized in a way that they weren't.
I think that's a really good point. One really memorable reporting experience I had this summer was sitting in a Zoom with a group of student activists and hearing how energized they were and the ways they were communicating with one another, even though they were remote. I think it does focus the mind in a way that campus can clutter it.
Mm-hmm. Or even high school, right? High school campus can clutter it too, right? If you've got play practice and you have, a zillion sports activities you're involved in, these students had a lot more free time to get depressed or bored, but also to channel it in these other ways. And for a lot of people, it was very fruitful and politicizing.
You've both given us a slew of great story ideas for the coming year. I can't thank you both enough for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Lindsay Ellis is a senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Bianca Vasquez Toness is a member of the Education Equity reporting team at the Boston Globe. Thanks again. And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about or a reporter you want to hear from, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.